At the dawn of the 14th century, Britain was not a unified land. It was a fractured realm where one crown sought to consume all others. England, under the iron will of King Edward I, aptly dubbed the Hammer of the Scots, was expanding, hungry for domination. But Edward didn't just want territory, he wanted submission. He wanted Scotland not merely defeated, but convinced that surrender was righteous, inevitable, even divine. Yet Scotland was unraveling. Its monarchy crumbled, its nobles splintered, and its people stood divided. In this vacuum of power, resistance seemed futile. That is, until a man with no title, no noble blood, and no claim to the throne stepped forward. Not as a king, but as a disruption. This is not a legend, it's a lesson carved in flesh, because the story of William Wallace isn't just about rebellion. It's about what an empire does when defiance refuses to die, and what it takes not to kill a man, but to erase the idea of him. William Wallace wasn't born to power, he was born to obscurity. The son of a minor landowner, with no noble lineage or place in royal courts, he emerged from the shadowed edges of society. He had no formal military training, no political backing, and no reason, by conventional standards, to become a threat to kings. And that is precisely what made him dangerous. In 1297, Wallace orchestrated a stunning guerrilla campaign against the occupying English forces. At Stirling Bridge, his ragtag army of farmers and outlaws annihilated a far superior English force. The victory was humiliating for Edward's generals. Men steeped in chivalric tradition, outmaneuvered by someone they deemed a savage. But worse than the defeat was what it gave Wallace: legend. In the aftermath, he was knighted and named Guardian of Scotland, a title soaked in urgency, not ceremony. For a brief, volatile moment, Wallace was not just a man, but a movement, the defiant voice of a nation refusing to kneel. But power, even righteous power, rarely lasts. Because Wallace's greatest weapon wasn't steel, it was the idea that England could be beaten. Wallace's victories didn't just bruise England's pride, they disrupted its narrative. Edward I wasn't merely waging war on a rebel, he was battling a symbol. A commoner had risen to command armies, embarrass nobles, and rally a broken nation. To an empire built on hierarchy and fear, this was intolerable. Even after military setbacks and betrayals by fellow Scots, Wallace didn't vanish. Others surrendered, compromised, or sought peace. Wallace disappeared into the hills, into legend, his mere survival a quiet, infuriating act of defiance. He became a ghost the English couldn't catch, and a myth they couldn't erase. That persistence was his ultimate crime, not treason, not murder, but resistance to the imperial script. He showed that fear could be refused, that power could bleed, and that submission wasn't destiny. When Wallace was finally betrayed in 1305 by John de Menteith, a Scottish noble who sided with Edward, the English didn't kill him immediately. They prepared something else, a ritual, not a sentence, a spectacle so brutal, so calculated, it would turn flesh into warning, pain into policy, and a man into an unperson. Wallace wasn't captured in glorious combat. There was no dramatic last stand, no final charge. He was handed over quietly, betrayed behind closed doors. And from that moment on, he ceased to be treated as a man. He became property of the crown, something to be displayed, dismantled, and ultimately discarded. Bound and shackled, he was dragged from Scotland to London, not hidden from view, but paraded through village after village. His journey was slow by design. Crowds were encouraged to jeer, spit, throw filth. Wallace rode tied to a horse, often bareback, his skin rubbed raw, his body deprived of sleep and food. This wasn't a transfer, it was psychological warfare. By the time he arrived in London, Wallace had been softened, not physically broken, but mentally worn down. The trial that awaited him was no trial at all. Held at Westminster Hall, the seat of English royal justice, it was theatre from start to finish. He was denied witnesses, denied a defence, denied dignity. Charged with treason, sacrilege, and barbarism, Wallace delivered only one answer: "I was never Edward's subject." That lone defiance shattered the illusion of justice. He hadn't just broken laws, he had denied the king's very right to rule, and for that he wouldn't simply die. He would be unmade. Wallace's sentence was not just death, it was disassembly, crafted to erase him piece by piece. On August 23, 1305, the execution began not with steel but with rope. Stripped nearly naked, wrists and ankles bound, he was tied behind a horse and dragged through the filth of London's streets. This was no chaotic outburst of medieval cruelty. It was deliberate policy, a ritual humiliation that made agony into performance. The route wound through the city's busiest districts. Mud, dung, blood, and stone tore at his body as spectators, conditioned to see him not as a man but as a monster, watched with glee or indifference. Children laughed, merchants jeered, clergy turned away. Each jolt across cobblestone, each lash of pain, was a lesson written in flesh. This is what happens when you defy the crown. By the time Wallace reached Smithfield, the chosen site of his execution, a market square for livestock, his body was bruised, bloodied, and broken. But more than that, his identity was stripped away. He was no longer the guardian of Scotland. He was meat, dragged through the empire's capital, offered up as spectacle. The crowd was not there for justice. They were there to witness what state power truly looked like, and the real horror hadn't even begun. At Smithfield, William Wallace stood barely alive, bloodied and broken from the dragging, but death was not yet his. The crowd pressed in, not for justice, but for theatre. First, he was hanged, not to kill, but to simulate death. Hoisted slowly by the neck, he choked and convulsed, his face swelling, his body twitching. Just before losing consciousness, he was cut down. What followed was ritual cruelty. A small hooked blade appeared, designed not for mercy, but for pain. Wallace was castrated, his severed genitals burned in front of him, a deliberate erasure of legacy. Then came the evisceration. His abdomen was sliced open and his intestines drawn out slowly, inch by inch, and thrown into the fire. Chroniclers say his eyes still followed the movement, conscious through the horror. Finally, his heart, symbol of courage, was cut out and cast into the flames. But even this wasn't the end. For the Empire, killing Wallace wasn't enough. His memory had to be dismantled, his body turned into a message. With Wallace's heart cast into the flames, his body was no longer a man. It was a message. But the spectacle demanded one final act. His head was severed, dipped in tar to prevent decay, and mounted high on a pike above London Bridge for all to see. It didn't face inward toward the city, it faced outward, a silent snarl to every traveller entering England's capital. This is the price of defiance. But even that wasn't sufficient. The rest of his body was quartered, hacked apart with axes and knives. Each limb and segment was sent across the kingdom with surgical symbolism. One to Newcastle, near the Scottish border. One to Berwick upon Tweed, a city tugged between English and Scottish control. Another to Perth, a former centre of resistance, and one to Stirling, where Wallace had once led Scotland's greatest victory. These were not burials, they were warnings. Body parts nailed to gates and walls, left to rot in open air, exposed to rain, dogs, and time. They were anatomical threats hung like trophies, not just "he died," but "this is what we do to those who fight back." Every severed limb was a state-sponsored sermon carved in flesh. The strategy was chillingly effective. Each piece of Wallace's body turned public spaces into sites of indoctrination. Children grew up beneath the shadow of a blackened arm nailed to a gate. Priests passed rotting flesh on their way to morning prayers. Merchants conducted business under the silent witness of a dead rebel's limb. The goal wasn't just to horrify, it was to condition. The presence of his remains in daily life made rebellion feel not just dangerous, but pointless. Yet even in this grotesque display, something slipped through the cracks. Whispers began to spread, not of fear, but of awe. The man who refused to kneel had endured the worst punishment imaginable, and he had not begged. He had not screamed. Even reduced to meat, Wallace remained a figure of staggering resolve. In trying to erase him, Edward's regime had accidentally magnified him. Wallace became not a corpse, but a symbol. His silence louder than screams, his mutilation more enduring than a clean death. The dismemberment that was meant to destroy him instead ensured his survival. In song, in myth, in memory. Edward III had hoped Wallace's execution would be the final word, a bloody period at the end of rebellion. Instead, it became a prologue. Though Wallace's body was scattered, his defiance took root. In taverns and churches, on battlefields, and in whispered prayers, his story lived on. Not the sanitized version, but the brutal truth. A man torn apart because he refused to bow. English chroniclers had detailed the execution with cold pride, thinking it would terrify generations. But memory doesn't always obey power. Over time, the horror they recorded became a testament to Wallace's endurance. His pain, instead of silencing resistance, inspired it. In trying to unmake a man, Edward had created a martyr, though Wallace never asked to be one. The spectacle designed to crush a nation's spirit had done the opposite. Scotland remembered not just how he died, but why. And in that memory, the idea of freedom, once dragged through the streets and burned, began to rise again. Wallace's death was meant to be the Empire's ultimate victory, a masterpiece of fear, precision, and domination. But instead of burying the cause, it transformed the man into something untouchable. His execution became more than a warning, it became a spark. Over the years, the scattered limbs rotted away, the tarred head crumbled, but the story endured. Not as a tale of defeat, but of defiance that refused to be erased. He became a symbol not because he died, but because of how he faced death. Silent, broken in body, but unbroken in will. The message the Crown tried to send, that resistance is agony, backfired. It revealed that even the full force of an empire couldn't crush the soul of a single man who believed. In time, Wallace was reborn in legend, his image carried forward by rebels, poets, and patriots. His execution, intended as closure, opened a wound the English could never cauterize. And so, the man they tried to silence by tearing him apart would echo louder than any king, not as a ghost, but as a fire that still burns,